Today's video is a massive spoiler for everything Final Fantasy VII related. If you haven't completed Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, please do so and come back to this video. It's one of the most iconic scenes of all time, a scene that would absolutely devastate gamers and fundamentally change video game storytelling forever. That is the death of Aerith Gainsborough. At the time, this was a groundbreaking scene that depicted a level of emotional depth that gamers had never seen before. There are many testimonies of how this is the first video game that actually brought some people to tears over its story. A sudden and tragic demise that was not just a plot twist, but a moment that challenged the narrative conventions of video games up until that point, evoking a profound sense of loss and grief in players. It wasn't just an important character in the story that died, but a playable party member who had equipment and limit breaks that you dedicated hours of gameplay to. Aerith was the healer in your party, and while everyone in the original Final Fantasy especially can fill many of the same roles, there was still a void left by Aerith in the party, and that impact was also felt by the developers, with Nomada saying, "Did you know people have been coming up to me for years now and saying, 'You killed Aerith?'" The theme of Final Fantasy VII was life, and we sacrificed Aerith in order to give weight and depth to that theme. Her death is a tragedy, but if we suddenly killed off everyone else after that, it would dilute the meaning of her death. When a character in a video game dies, no one thinks it's sad. They're just characters in a game after all. You can just reset the game and try again, or you can always revive them somehow. I felt that their lives didn't have that much weight. With life as our theme for FF7, I thought we should try depicting a character who really dies for good, who can't come back. For that death to resonate, it needed to be an important character, so we thought that killing off the heroine would allow players to think more deeply about that theme. So when Final Fantasy VII Remake was first announced in 2015, this was the first scene that so many people thought of, and we imagined it in various ways. From will there be blood to will there be no blood? Will she die in a different place or in a different way? Many felt that the one thing this remake needed to get right was that Aerith needed to die. Of course, that's not to say that everyone felt that way. A poll ran by a Japanese publication, MyNavi, asking players who played Final Fantasy VII what they most want to see in the remake, back when the remake was first announced in 2015, adding a route where Aerith lived took the #1 spot. Then enter the twist of the Arbiters of Fate, beings that were tasked with keeping destiny in place, a destiny that we would then defy at the end of Final Fantasy VII Remake. Many concluded that with destiny broken, an event no longer guaranteed to happen as they did in the original game meant that it was entirely possible for Aerith to live. All of these thoughts and all of this conjecture placed a ton of weight on Final Fantasy VII Rebirth's ending scene. And now Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is finally here, and all that time since the Final Fantasy VII Remake tech demo that wasn't even the official announcement of the game that had people imagining what Aerith's death would look like in HD, this scene presents something wildly different than any of our imaginations could have conjured at that time. Final Fantasy VII Remake's ending was incredibly risky. However, one of the reasons I think that it paid off in the way that it did was that it empowered people to believe whatever they wanted to believe. If this ending meant that Aerith was going to live, you could entirely reason that. If this ending meant that Zack was coming back or not, you could selectively believe whichever way you wanted to. If it meant that the story would diverge or stay the same, whichever way you wanted to read it, you absolutely could. Nothing was truly different yet. There was only the looming promise that things might change, but nobody knew to exactly what extent they would. This allowed people to think and believe what they wanted to, and it allowed many theories to prosper. And while this ending also has many of those same qualities, there's also a lot more that's hard to ignore with this game's ending. Some people love and are enthralled by these new mysteries, while many others feel incredibly off-put by them. IGN even running an article titled "Final Fantasy VII Rebirth Fails Its Most Important Moment," referring to the death of Aerith. I do think that Aerith gets a lot of emotional moments here. In particular, the final moments that she spends with Cloud are very endearing and does allow you to get a bombastic goodbye with her, though one may criticize that this removes the sudden aspect of the death and making it a bit more Hollywood-esque. And although Aerith does die in this ending, it's obscured by the mystery of the fact that she's still there in Cloud's mind, where Cloud is seeing two timelines, and many other theories surrounding what is going on and why Cloud is still seeing her. I think many people find find themselves intrigued by the mystery of what's happening here, but that mystery seems to be coming at the cost of losing the emotional weight of that death scene. In particular, the loss of the iconic lowering of the body into the water, a moment that I feel confident will come back in part 3, when Cloud remembers what actually happens, though one may argue that the efficacy of her death will be diluted, not having that scene present here in the moment where it matters most. I think my biggest question about the ending is what exactly is the player supposed to feel when viewing it? There is so much going on that it is literally difficult to emotionally process. You have the death of Aerith, but also maybe not the death of Aerith. You have the entire multiverse opening up with different timelines diverging. You have Zack and Cloud reuniting, and a boss fight with 500 million phases. Because of this, there is so much going on at one time. It might overwhelm the player in such a way that they don't really know what to think about the ending. That being said, I do think with time, as people are able to digest all of these mysteries that were thrown at them, they may come out a lot more positive feeling about the ending. What's going to happen with Cloud and the black materia, the torn sky, and whatever is going on with Zack and the seeming multiverse, as well as Cloud seeing Aerith alive and not alive, might be black box mysteries that continue to keep people hooked. And I suspect as they think and theorize on these ideas, they may not view the ending in such a negative light overall. Of course, as I mentioned, the player is overwhelmed by all that is going on, and one concern that I do have for the next part is that with all of these mysteries, it makes you wonder how part 3 will wrap them all up in a timely manner without things feeling significantly rushed. While the purpose of Zack in this game was to be able to explore the multiverse and show what's happening in the other worlds, the overarching narrative purpose of Zack is still really unclear. So part 3 has the heavy task of not just using Zack to explore these other worlds, but to also show us why the developers made the decision to bring him back and what he is going to bring to the story to enhance it, aside from just the joy of seeing a fan favorite character again. Genuinely speaking, I wish we had more time to play as him in Rebirth, and I also feel like he should have just got more in general. The moment at the end of the game where he joined in the Sephiroth boss fight was a long memed moment where I often joke that Zack would come out of a portal and he and Cloud would fight Sephiroth together. And funny enough, that is exactly what happened. However, his role in the ending feels like he showed up for a bombastic fan service moment and then disappeared. Perhaps I'm the one who is blind to the purpose of this, but genuinely speaking, outside of the hype and the fan service, the actual narrative purpose of this is beyond me at the moment. There is also the purpose of the multiple worlds. Now, there is a ton of conjecture on these worlds. Some people are still saying that this isn't a multiverse and whatever. We could have those arguments all day long. However, the big question is, what is the purpose that it's bringing to the story? I can't think of too many ways so far in which it's enhanced the story, with many people in the community noting that so far it feels like it only serves the purpose of making things more convoluted, and seemingly so far it hasn't actually made any sort of impact that changes anything. If this story could be told without multiple worlds, why include them in the first place? This is where I want to note that currently I don't have all the information. Nobody does. And as a result, I won't outright say that all of these things are meaningless. Not until we have the full picture with Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 3. I am sure they plan to eventually go somewhere with it. And wherever they do go with it, it'll be in such a way that makes you recontextualize Part 1 and 2. I'm a firm believer in the narrative principle Chekhov's gun. Chekhov's gun is a principle that states every element in a story must be necessary. An irrelevant element should be removed. For example, if a writer features a gun in a story, there must be a reason for it, such as it being fired sometime later in the plot. All elements must eventually come into play at some point in the story. I think that adding all of these new things should come into play, and they should come into play in a major way. In such a major way that it makes you say, this is the superior telling of Final Fantasy VII, or it's better off as a sequel, as some of you will say, because they added these things. The burden thus far for me is going to be on Part 3 to make all of the mysteries in Part 1 and Part 2, that thus far's only contribution is the curiosity that they add, pay off in more ways than just being an interesting mystery. That is a massive burden to place on Part 3. Of course, Part 3 also has the weapon fights, all the events of Disc 2 and 3, making Cid and Vincent playable, on top of resolving all of these conflicts. And I'm incredibly curious curious to see exactly how the developers will pull it off. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is an excellent game, and I completely understand why some people love it and hate the ending. I can genuinely understand both sides of the argument here, and ultimately, only time will tell if the developers are able to pull it off.